I think it's fair to say consolidated democracy in Asia is rare. There's 4 consolidated democracies in Asia. After World War II, there was India, and then Japan became a democracy with the U.S. occupation, and has become a democracy. In terms of the so-called third wave of Huntington's democracies, basically you have South Korea and Taiwan, and I think you could probably date 1988 or thereabouts for both countries. Maybe Korea was in 1987, the process started, but pretty much from the late 1980s, both countries began the process of democratization, and I think it's fair to say they've consolidated. I don't think anyone in South Korea or in Taiwan wants to go back to the dictatorial old days. You can say other countries have certainly started the road to democratization, and Indonesia, Philippines, Mongolia, I think have sprouts, but I have questions about whether those democracies have consolidated. And if you take places like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, China, and Pakistan, all of these are dictatorships. We just had a program about Thailand recently, and the military control is very, very strong in Thailand today. Now, prior to the Japanese colonial period in both Korea and in Taiwan, things were very different between the two. Korea was a monarchy which was sometimes ruled under the suzerainty of others. For example, when the Mongols ruled Korea, or when the Manchus were, we could say, rulers above the Korean monarchs. Taiwan, on the other hand, prior to the Dutch, was a disunited island of Austronesian peoples. And there were then, when the Dutch came, there were a series of colonial regimes that is ruled by outsiders in the interests of the outsiders. So the Dutch came in 1624, and they were booted out in 1662. And the Dutch and the Spanish were in a lot of competition in Europe, and in fact, the Spanish had controlled Holland. And so when the Dutch, who were based in Asia, were based in what's now Indonesia, the Spanish were based in what's now the Philippines, in Manila. When the Dutch set up a base in southern Taiwan, the Spanish said, we have to go to northern Taiwan to keep things equal. But the Dutch and the Aborigines booted the Spanish out in 1640. It actually should be 1642. Then came a family called the Zheng family. Was led by a man named Zheng Chenggong in Taiwan, or Koxing, he's sometimes called. Now, if you call him a Chinese, yes, he was of Chinese background. Yes, he was from Fujian province, but he was a great trader. And at this time, during the Ming Dynasty, and then even later, the trade was not allowed. He was basically a pirate, or a pirate trader. And he certainly wasn't an official of the Chinese government. In fact, he was in some ways opposed to it. But he then, in 1662, decided to set up a base in Taiwan, because he'd been trading with the Dutch and others, and he kicked the Dutch out after quite a long battle. And within a few months of his success in Taiwan, he died. He was 39 years old, and he was obviously crazy. He was obviously mentally ill. And some people today argue he might have had tertiary syphilis, the venereal disease, and when you get to the third stage, you go crazy. And his family continued to run Taiwan until the Manchus booted them out in 1683, I mean. So they were there for another 20 years. Then the Manchus came in 1683, and they stayed till 1895, and then the Japanese came in. So I would argue the Japanese were the fifth colonial regime, and then under Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Ching-kuo, you had another colonial regime. Well, under the Japanese Empire, of course, the two key parts were Taiwan and South Korea. These were the two big parts of the Japanese Empire. And Taiwan was part of the empire from 1895 to 1945. Korea became informally a part of the Japanese Empire with the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. The Treaty of Portsmouth, of course, ended the Russo-Japanese War. And then in 1910, there was another treaty, and Korea formally became part of the Japanese Empire. And these are just some notes that from lecture notes that I've given in the past. If you look at the size of Japan and then of Taiwan and Korea as a proportion, Taiwan was about 10% of the area, and Korea was close to 60% of the area of Japan. So they were substantial additions. And then in terms of population, 1935 thereabouts, again, Taiwan added 7.5% population, but Korea added another third to the population of the empire. So these were the two key parts of the empire. Now, there were a lot of similarities between what happened in South Korea and what happened in Taiwan when the Japanese took over. First of all, both of them killed lots of Taiwanese and Koreans. So in the initial years, the Japanese were very strong and repressed all the opposition. Secondly, both had strong police states. Third, there was basic education, not high-level education, but basic education pushed in both places. And there was, I guess you could say, a modernization that took place in both places. But if you take, for example, both Korea and Taiwan had a Japanese university. The university was primarily for Japanese who lived in Korea and in Taiwan, not for the local people, although some local people got to go. In both places, you had improved public health. So in Taiwan, malaria was ended. Originally, Taiwan had huge amount of malaria, and the Japanese were able to get rid of that. In both places, you had a limited Kominka movement towards when the Japanese began World War II. They set up a Kominka movement to try to make Koreans and Taiwanese little Japanese. They weren't going to be real Japanese, but they were going to speak Japanese and have Japanese names. And in both countries, they had this Kominka movement, which was limited, but there were attempts to implement it. Under Taisho democracy in Japan, you had some liberalization in both countries after 1918. There was Woodrow Wilson's self-determination speech of the 18th of January 1918 towards the end of World War I. And that speech seems to have really stimulated a lot of interest in democratic ideas, so this idea of self-determination. In Korea, of course, you had the March 1st movement of 1919, and that really was powerful through the empire. You had a lot of liberal Japanese in Japan pushing both Koreans and Taiwanese, or not necessarily pushing, but working with Koreans and Taiwanese to try to improve the situation in the colonies. And it's very interesting, there were a number of publications in Taiwan that took place, and there were a lot of movements in Taiwan during this period of time, but most of the publications were forbidden to be published in Taiwan. They were actually published in Japan and then transported to Taiwan. So there was a cooperation, and it's interesting. Taiwan, you had civilian governors general from 1919 to 1936, but in Korea, all of the governors general were military leaders. And the other thing that was very similar for both empires, with both Koreans and Taiwanese were second-class subjects in the Japanese empire. Never did they have equality with the Japanese. Now, what were some differences? This is actually, if any of you know, I've been told this, but I'm not absolutely sure. My understanding is the Japanese army controlled Korea, the Korean colony, and the Japanese Navy controlled the Taiwan colony. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but that might be one reason there were some differences. In Taiwan, as I said, you had civilian governors general from 1919 to 1936, but in Korea, you only had military governors general. In Korea, less than 3% of the population were Japanese, and Taiwan was much higher, it was 6%. Now, this had another implication, which was in Taiwan, the highest level a Taiwanese actually got to was the head of a gun, a head of a county. But in Korea, in the colonial government, Koreans rose higher up. So maybe there was more repression under the military, but because of the smaller number of Japanese, Koreans actually were able to rise higher in the system. Now, I would argue there were at least three contributions of the Japanese colonial empire to Korean and Taiwan democratization. And you had strong Japanese bureaucratic rule, which established patterns of administration which enhanced post-war efficiency. Now, this isn't a one-to-one thing. It didn't mean that the governments in Taiwan or in Korea after the war were efficient, but there was this pattern and this sort of ideal that existed. And in Taiwan, when the nationalists came after 1945, I mean, people didn't like the Japanese, and they would compare. They would say that nationalists were like pigs. The Japanese were more like dogs. So the Japanese were like pigs. They were corrupt and they didn't do things very well, whereas the dogs were efficient, but they bit you, but they weren't corrupt. I would argue that Japanese colonial experience enhanced national consciousness in both countries. And thirdly, I would argue the Japanese colonial experience advanced both countries economically, socially, and educationally. After World War II, both countries had dictatorships, but the dictatorships were different. In Taiwan, the Kuomintang established a colonial dictatorship that was a dictatorship of outsiders who controlled the majority Taiwanese and who controlled all of the key positions right through to 1988. There were certain positions that Taiwanese never had. We can talk about this some more in a few minutes. Basically, there was one regime under Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Jing-kuo, and it was basically civilian government and one-party rule. Now in Korea, you had the 5 republics. So there was regime change taking place, but also you had military government. So from 1961 to 1987, you had the government of Park Chung-hee and then the government of Chun Doo-hwan. And of course, under Park Chung-hee, you had the constitutional change to the Yushin Constitution. Now, some post-war similarities. I think both regimes were violent, especially post-war. Both had successful land reforms. Actually, I've just read a very interesting book by Dr. Yo at Australian National University. He stresses the land reform as being really important to both Taiwan and to South Korea in terms of future equality. Both economies shifted from import substitution to export oriented in the 1960s. Both achieved considerable social mobility, rural to urban social mobility, and also mobility up the social scale. Both moved to greater equality, and both emphasized the importance of education. Now, I've raised this as a question, is this related to Confucianism? I don't know. My own feeling is the Confucian nature of places like Korea and Taiwan and others, I think has been overstated. I think it's useful, but how many people today talk about filial piety in Korea? It's not very common, is it? And I think my hunch, I'm not absolutely 100% on this, but my feeling is it was the dictators of Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Jing-kuo and the dictators here who emphasized Confucianism because they wanted people to obey them, rather than South Korea or Taiwan are intrinsically Confucian societies. But we can talk about that some more if you want. Now, what were some post-war differences? Those are post-war similarities. What were some post-war differences? In Korea, you pushed heavy in chemical industries. As a result, you had the chaebol, you had economic concentration, and those who were economically powerful under the military regimes, of course, were loyal to the military regimes. And if they weren't loyal, they got booted and they lost out. In Taiwan, you had mainly small and medium enterprises, which were controlled by Taiwanese who were seen as potential opposition. There were state-owned enterprises controlled by the mainlanders, so there was this sort of bifurcation within the Taiwan economy, but I think in that sense, the way the Taiwan economy developed and the way the Korean economy developed was quite different. I think the Korean military was much more violent in government than the Taiwan government. We'll talk a bit more about that, comparing Kaohsiung and Gwangju. Korean demonstrations as a whole were more violent. And this is an interesting one. I'm not quite sure how to handle this. Perhaps Professor Lee might have an idea too. Korea, under the dictatorships, had central elections, but they abolished local elections. And in Taiwan, basically, they abolished central elections and had local elections. But none of the elections were free. I mean, they were all controlled to some extent or another. Now, this is where I wanted to talk a bit about Kaohsiung and Gwangju. Kaohsiung incident in Taiwan, December 1979, and then the trials took place later, was very significant for Taiwan's democratization. The Gwangju massacre, which took place in May 1980, so it's only 6 months later, was also significant for Korea's democratization. Neither of them made the country's democracies, but both of them had a long-term effect. Interestingly, both took place in the southwest of the country. So Guangzhou was in the southwest and Kaohsiung is in the southwest. But there were differences too. In Kaohsiung, the leadership of the Kaohsiung demonstration was the central leadership of the opposition. So the people who were in Kaohsiung at the time, they were the leaders of the opposition. They were the central leaders. Now, when Guangzhou took place, there was a series of demonstrations all around South Korea, and the Guangzhou leadership was a local leadership. There were local leadership. There were, as I said, many demonstrations taking place at the same time against the military government. So the opposition in Guangzhou was not central opposition. It was local. It was lower down in the whole framework of opposition within South Korea. Secondly, in Kaohsiung, the government screamed violence. They said, "This is a violent incident." Well, if you look at what happened in Kaohsiung, not one person was killed, and to the best of my knowledge, no one was permanently injured. So the government said, "Oh, you've been violent. You've hurt 182 security people, or you've hurt 183 security people." Actually, if you look at the newspapers, the day after they said 20 people or 40 people. And of course, they didn't mention all the demonstrators that were hurt by the military and the security agencies. Well, in Guangzhou, the official statistics are 191 were killed, but there have been many sources that say many more people were killed than 191. Many people say as many as 1,000 or more. And I've read where outside Guangzhou in the countryside, people were shot and then they just buried them. And only recently have they started to find graves. So in terms of the violence, there's a huge difference. And the other thing is the Kaohsiung leadership was very prominent. As I said, the Kaohsiung leadership was central leadership in the opposition. And it became very prominent in Taiwan's democratization. Sure, they went to jail, but many of them later came out and were significant leaders. In Guangzhou, only 2 of the 12 people who were on the leadership committee in Guangzhou ever served in the National Assembly, and they served only 1 term each. And in fact, at least 1, if not more, of the 12 were killed during the Guangzhou massacre. Nothing like that happened in Taiwan. Now, I've just written a new book about the Kaohsiung incident. Actually, it's coming out next month. But there were 3 prominent groups that came out of Kaohsiung that contributed to democratization. The first group were the defendants themselves. And if you know anything about Taiwan, people like Huang Xingjie, Shi Mingde, Zhang Junhong, Chen Yu, Li Nixiong, Annette Liu, or Liu Xiulian, the former vice president, Yao Zhaowen. There were all these people who were active, who were imprisoned, and then became active when they were released from prison and Taiwan democratized. The second group is also very interesting. These are the lawyers that defended the people. Many of these lawyers became politically active only when they came and were involved in the defense, because there were several trials and they were involved in the defense. And many of these people became very politically prominent too. Like Chen Shui-bian became president. Su Zhengchang was a premier. Frank Xie was a premier. Yo Qing was a major county executive and a member of the control branch. Zhang Junshong was a premier. Zhang Pengzheng was a person in the control branch. I mean, these are really important, people who became important in Taiwan's democratization, and they became important because they were lawyers for the defendants. And the third group, I don't think was quite as important overall, but at the time they were very significant, are the wives and family members of political prisoners. These are people who weren't imprisoned and weren't accused and then ran for office still during the dictatorship, and sometimes were very successful and often led the elections as people were trying to demonstrate sympathy for the political prisoners. Now, I would argue both democratizations in South Korea and in Taiwan, in a sense, were led from the inside. In Taiwan, the case is quite clear, with President Lee Teng-hui succeeded Jiang Jingguo as president. He was the vice president, he became the president. Now, I need to make very clear, Jiang Jingguo did not designate Lee Teng-hui as his successor. He was vice president, and the precedents before had been that if the president died, the vice president would become president, but that didn't mean he became leader. So when Chiang Kai-shek died, his son, who was premier, became leader and leader of the party. the president just sort of became a figurehead. And many people in Taiwan expected Lee Teng-hui to become a figurehead. But he was a tough political operator, and he worked hard, and he worked with the opposition, and he worked with liberal people in the ruling Kuomintang, and he was able to become powerful. In Korea, No Tae-woo was also of the old regime. He was part of Chun Doo-hwan's military, and he seemed to have reformed. He used the Seoul Olympics, and he cooperated with the opposition, and he won the presidency against divided opposition. So in both cases, you have an ability to compromise, I think, and an ability to work with the opposition, and people who are reasonably politically clued in were important. But also, and I don't want to forget this, in both countries, opposition was also important. So the democratic opposition, which wasn't in power, also helped move things along. Now, what were some factors that helped democratization in both South Korea and Taiwan? I argue there's 7. And then I've got 3 more which Taiwan had but South Korea didn't have. So we talked a bit before about administrative, economic, social, and education development under the Japanese. There were relatively high educational levels under Japan and also in the post-war dictatorships. So under Japan, there was pushing of primary education, and then later there was more pushing under the dictatorships of higher education. Both countries had a little bit of electoral experience under the Japanese as well as under the post-war dictatorships. So people learned to go vote, to cast ballots, even if the elections were controlled. In both, you had increasing prosperity with increasing equality. So especially, I know the figures from Taiwan better than I know the ones from South Korea, but in both cases you had Gini coefficients improved. There was more equality over time in both places. Again, to some extent that was linked to the land reform. You had links between government and opposition. They weren't just sort of in completely 2 different places. And in both cases you had American political pressure. That becomes very clear when you read the memoirs of various people. And this is very important. Both countries were affected by the fall of President Marcos. Most people didn't think President Marcos was going to fall, and then boom, he was gone. And that led to a lot of pressure in both South Korea and here in Taiwan. Now, Taiwan had 3 more factors that South Korea didn't have. In the government in Taiwan, there were a number of what you might call liberals, people who had a bit more open ways of thinking. Now, in Korea, you had mainly military leaders, and military leaders don't tend to be liberals, and they don't tend to have liberal education. Military education tends to be rather more narrow. So there were a lot more liberals, I think. There were 1 or 2 or 3. I've listed them in an article. But there weren't very many in South Korea, but there were a fair number in Taiwan. In Taiwan, you had a nonviolent democratic opposition, an opposition which was committed to nonviolence and to democracy. And third, and this is interesting, Taiwan had a lot of popular associations. There were farmers' associations. Now, these were originally set up by the Japanese, and they operated in Taiwan in a way that they sometimes actually represented the farmers. They were controlled by the party, and they were controlled by the local government, and often they were involved in factions at local levels, but they also worked on behalf of the farmers. And there was a system in Taiwan where to get fertilizer, you had to trade it for grain, and the exchange rate was very poor. So fertilizer for the farmers was very, very expensive. And the Farmers Association, this is not fair, this is not fair, this is not fair. And finally, through the Farmers Associations and others, this system was abolished. I can't remember the specific year. It was something like 1977 or thereabouts. And Lee Teng-hui was actually involved in that at the time. There's one more question, and that's the role of religion. Now, in Taiwan, Presbyterians have been very Taiwanese, associated with Taiwanese, Taiwan ideology and Taiwan freedom. But there have been a lot of Protestants and Catholics who have not been particularly pro-democracy in Taiwan. Now in Korea, this might be somewhat different. And of course in Korea, the number of Protestants and Catholics as a proportion of the total population is much higher in Korea than it is anywhere else in Asia other than the Philippines. So we could talk more about that if you'd like. Now I'd like just to make a few more comparisons. Institutionally, both countries now have a president and a premier. So you have dual leadership. The president's independently elected, but the premier also has a role. Both have unicameral legislatures. You call it the National Assembly, but in Taiwan now we've actually moved to having the president and the legislature elected at the same time, and they have the same term of office. That hasn't happened here yet. So I guess you're having your National Assembly election very soon, but the presidential election's still a couple years off. In Korea, the fault lines strike me as geographic. So you have the southwest, the Gwangju area was always a bit different, a bit in opposition, pro-democratic. In Taiwan, there's sort of a north-south division, which you might say is geographic, but it's also an ethnic division. Both countries had attempted impeachments of the first opposition president. So Roh Moo-hyun and Chen Shui-bian. Roh Moo-hyun is actually impeached. Chen Shui-bian, he wasn't impeached, but there was a lot of talk about it. And it was very interesting. I remember talking to Kuomintang legislators, or people who were Kuomintang legislators, and they would come back home, and then people would say, why do you want to impeach Chen Shui-bian? He's just elected. And actually Chen Shui-bian had very, very high popularity ratings in those times. And some of those people, some of those legislators came back to their home area, and people said, why are you impeaching him? And they said, yeah, why are we doing that? And some of them actually became members of the DPP. And some of the prominent members of the DPP became DPP members as a result of the impeachment. And in Korea, you've had two transfers of power, and now in Taiwan, you've had the election, which means there's going to be a third transfer of power, although the president isn't inaugurated until May 20th. Now, I'm going to do two more things. I had a final question. I'm going to throw this out, but then I want to do a couple more things. In some ways, even though the timing isn't quite right, in some ways, South Korea and Taiwan have sort of followed each other. So Kim Dae-jung was elected, I think it's fair to say, the first real opposition person to be elected, and then Roh Moo-hyun was followed on. And similar time, Chen Shui-bian was elected. It's actually 2000, not 200. So that was, in both cases, that's the first change of government, one could argue. Then the second change of government is when the conservatives came back. So Im Yoon-bak was elected in 2008, and Park Geun-hye in 2013. And Ma Ying-jeou had two terms of government, 2008 and 2016. That's the second change of government. Now, in January 2016, Tsai Ing-wen won a landslide victory for the presidency, and the DPP won the legislature. So this is Taiwan's third change of government. So the next question is, will the National Assembly and the next presidential election in Korea also mean a change of government? So I'm throwing that out as a question we can talk about. Here's some things that I've published on democratization, mainly in Taiwan, but also a couple things. The first two compare South Korea and Taiwan. And then I just wanted to raise one thing because I think we're going to have a focus on Taiwan, so I might as well talk about this first. I've just added this. The issue of identity in Taiwan is very important. So people are asking questions, who are we? And this is something people talk about a lot in Taiwan. Now, there are a number of surveys in Taiwan, and all of them show that people who say we're Chinese, it goes down, and the numbers have dropped very significantly, and those who say we are Taiwanese has gone up hugely. Now, all the surveys show the same thing. The absolute numbers are not necessarily the same, but they show the same trends. Now, this survey is done by the Election Studies Center at National Zhengzhou University, and started in 1992 in the early days of democratization, and has continued right to the present. Now, if you look at this blue line, that's those that say, I am only Chinese. So in 1992, 1 out of 4 people said, I am only Chinese. And now that's dropped to less than 4%. So only less than 4% of the people say, I am only Chinese in Taiwan. 96% say I'm something else. Now the one that was the most important for many years was I am both Chinese and Taiwanese. So that people felt that they were both. And it was in the high 40s, and now it's dropped into the low 30s. And of course, the green line is the significant one. In 1992, 1 out of 6 people said, I'm only Taiwanese. That has now gone up to 60%. And what's interesting is when it crosses the 40, goes above 50%, that point there is after Ma Ying-jeou has become president. So Ma Ying-jeou in some ways is the most saying I'm Chinese of all the presidents in democratic Taiwan, but while he's president, the number who say I'm Taiwanese has actually gone above 50%. And the last line is also interesting. The black line is I don't know. The answer is I don't know or I don't want to answer. Now, originally it was over 10%. And what this meant, I think, was in the early days of democratization, people were afraid to answer surveys. If I answer this survey, how will it be used against me when things become undemocratic again? Well, now it's less than, it's just 4%. But the other thing that this shows is that in Taiwan, at least, people think about this question. They talk about it. Who are we? What are we? And the result is more and more people are saying, I'm just Taiwanese. And that means I'm not Chinese. And what's also interesting is the number that say, I am Taiwanese, the younger generation is even more. So it's more than 60% among the young generation. So in this last election, the young people came in and voted overwhelmingly for the DPP. And many of them had parents and grandparents who were Kuomintang. And it's interesting that the Kuomintang voters, many of them abstained as well. But the young people seem to have gone and voted. So that's why I was arguing that it's a little bit different. In Korea, I think your identity is you're Koreans. I mean, you might say I'm from the South or the North and have some difference there, but there's a historical basis for being Koreans in a way there isn't for being Taiwanese. I mean, a unified Korea goes way, way back, even if you've been ruled by Mongols and Manchus for periods of time. In Taiwan, it's rather a different situation.